Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Simpson Center for Food and Agricultural Policy webinar, Reducing Food-Related Emissions, Indicators, and Carbon Labeling. As you see, we did just have a land acknowledgement up on the screen. Unfortunately, it looks like our sound wasn't working, but it is important to acknowledge that we are here on Indigenous territory. Today's topic is focused on food emissions and trying to meet our zero emission targets. So before I introduce today's panelists, a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you're having difficulties hearing the webinar at any time today, or you're experiencing an unreliable internet signal, you can always use the call-in number included in your webinar registration email, or by clicking the arrow next to the microphone icon and pressing the switch to phone audio button. There's a box labeled Q&A. This is where you can pose your question to the panelists. If you see a question in the Q&A box that you think is important to ask, you can also click the thumbs up icon under the question to move it to the front of the queue. The structure of today's webinar will consist of two presentations, and at the end of each presentation, we're going to have a poll question and an opportunity for you to pose your questions to the panelists. Feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box at any time, but please note we're going to wait until the end of today's presentation to ask the questions to the panelists. Join me in welcoming our presenters today. First up, we have Professor John Thordsson from Aarhus University in Denmark. John is the author of A Better Carbon Footprint Label and many other publications. We also have David McInnes, the principal of DMCI Strategies. David has been leading a coalition of over 80 public and private partners to develop Canada's first agri-food sustainability index. And before we begin with John, we do have a poll question for you, so we'll pop that up right now. Our question for you today, if it pops up, do you feel that eco-labeling is an effective method to influence consumers' buying habits? Yes or no? This is going to be the focus of John's presentation, so we think it'll be a good starter for you folks. So we'll give you about a minute to answer it, and then we'll let John jump into his presentation. All right, and it looks like 76% of you said yes, that you do feel eco-labeling is an effective method, with 24% of you saying no. So with that, John, take it away.
Thank you, Sean. I'll share my screen, and that must be the one, yeah. Yep. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to talk today. It's a pleasure to share some of my research with this audience. I'm going to talk about how carbon labeling has been used and can be used for reducing food-related emissions. Let me see, but I cannot. Here it is. I just about myself a little bit more. I'm a professor of economic psychology at Aarhus University in Denmark, and I also have a professorship at the Technical University of Norway in the Department of Psychology. I'm an economist by training, but I mostly do research that is well, behavioral economics or economic psychology. I have published extensively on consumer behavior in the environmental field, but and sustainability marketing, and also quite a number of publications of eco-labeling. So that has been like one of my interests for a couple of decades now, actually. Now, it's of course important to realize that it's possible to inform about carbon footprints in other ways than labeling. So labeling is one of the ways we communicate about carbon footprint, but more generally, in most countries, at least most developed countries of the world, there's of course also more general information and education informing consumers about the relative carbon impact of different types of food, such as, beef is the most carbon heavy, most carbon taxing type of food, and fruits and vegetables are not only much healthier, but also much better for the climate. But like in the recent decades, the labeling, the using of labels on food to inform consumers of their environmental footprint of the food has become increasingly popular, so that give consumers information about the specific carbon or environmental footprint of the different products, so that especially so that consumers are able to distinguish within a specific product category the most eco-friendly of the different products. In Europe, much of this, like in Europe, there's been eco labels for non-food products for, like, I think since the early 1990s, but in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a work going on to develop also, or to extend this, the labeling to the food area since 2007 within the framework of product environmental footprint. And there's now like a tested framework in Europe for communicating product environmental footprint, which has though not been implemented in labeling. There's a reference to labeling in this regulation, but it's only referring to the EU eco-label and to the ISO system, and until now at least, the specific labeling of products has been delegated to the individual member countries of the European Union and to companies to do their own, retailers doing their own labeling. In Denmark, where I'm from, there has been a discussion about climate labeling of food products for some years now. And in the spring last year, the Minister for Food appointed a working group with stakeholder representatives that had the task of developing a proposal for a state-controlled climate label, which would be the first state-controlled climate label of the world. The plan was that this labeling should be, or at least the proposal should be ready before the end of the year. But we had a general election in October, which has, when there's a general election, all of this kind of work is set on a standby. So we haven't received it yet, but it should come during the spring here. And the good thing about this working group was that it had representatives for all the major retailers in Denmark and industry associations, as well as the Consumer Council and the Nature Conservation Association. The task description said that they were to develop a climate label that should be unambiguous, simple, and easy to understand. And also importantly, the task was to develop a voluntary label rather than a mandatory one. I'll come back to the implications of that later in my talk. Well, climate labeling has until now been tested in a number of different retailers in Europe. One of the tests was in the largest Danish discount retailer, which is called Netto. Netto tested a climate labeling in 2 of its stores for half a year in 2021. And you can see a picture from the trial store to the right on the slide. The carbon label that they used was within category labeling, and using that blue cloud that you can see with CO2 in the middle, pointing at the best carbon choice within product categories. And the report from these tests revealed, I think the most important result was that the sale of beef in the two stores fell by 4%, and the sale of beef cold cuts by 6% when compared to sales in other stores. And since beef is the most carbon taxing food that is sold in the store, that's of course an encouraging result. And in general, all of the tests that's been done of eco-labeling and like the carbon labeling and other types of eco-labels, both academic tests and practical tests, generally reveals that eco-labeling works, but it works under certain circumstances. Of course, a prerequisite for the labeling to work is that it's actually used by producers. And this is where the issue of mandatory versus voluntary comes in. It's been shown that a number of voluntary labels are not necessarily used by producers, and if they are not used, consumers are not exposed to them, and of course cannot use them in practice. In addition, eco-labels need to be trustworthy. If they are not perceived as trustworthy, consumers will not use them. And the reason why it's not necessarily perceived as trustworthy is that there have been cases also where non-certified, private eco-labels by companies have been, label-like messages have been used that were not necessarily completely trustworthy. So the research shows that the most effective eco-labels are those that are certified by a third party, and the most effective third party is in most countries is the state. So state-controlled labels are more trustworthy and more effective. It's also a prerequisite for eco-labeling to work that specific eco aspect that's labeled is important to consumers, and especially an eco-label helps the environmentally concerned consumer to make the right choice, like the intended choice, and so which means that the label actually works for consumers that are informed and concerned about the environment, but it doesn't work for consumers or in the context where consumers are not concerned for the environment. And of course, it doesn't work for consumers for whom the eco issues are not important. And of course, finally, the eco-label needs to be known and understood reasonably correctly by consumers. Like it has to be, as was said in the Danish case, unambiguous and simple and easy to understand. So it has to communicate in a clear way, in a clear and understandable way. And unfortunately, that is not always the case. Let me first illustrate this issue of knowing and understanding with a very successful labeling in Denmark, which is the Danish organic label. The Danish organic label was introduced in the market in 1990, and now it's known by everybody. But like we did a study in my research group in 1995, where we investigated the effectiveness of this label to transform consumer buying intentions into buying behavior, to bridge the intention behavior gap. What we did was that, like, I had a grad student who was a very good designer, and he designed two fake organic labels, or two designs that could be the correct one but weren't. And then we asked participants in the study to pick the right one, and about half of the sample were able to pick the right label. That's the one that we represent by the reddish line there, and the other half did not recognize the label. Those that are represented by the bluish line. what these two lines that you can see on the graph here are regression lines, and the steep line means that there is a stronger relationship between intentions and behavior. And so basically, for those who recognized the label, there was a strong relationship between buying intentions and behavior, but those that didn't recognize it, that relationship was weak. Notice, so that's how this illustrates how such an eco-label works. It doesn't make people who have a low buying intention, like down here, it didn't make those people buy organic food. It only made those that had a high buying intention buy organic food. So a label helps those consumers who wants to buy the eco-friendly products. But it does so only if consumers understand it. Like the world's first carbon label was introduced by the UK retailer Tesco in 2007. And this labeling became a failure, a complete failure, and they took it off. They removed it from the store again in 2012, among other things for this reason. This carbon label communicated the carbon footprint of each product in the way you can see on these pictures here. Like it showed the grams per serving of carbon on the label, but consumers were actually. Research showed that consumers could not really understand the message, and because they didn't really understand the label, they also didn't use it for their shopping. In a study with another grad student of mine, we investigated if it was possible to improve this particular label, by adding traffic light colors to the label, traffic light colors that would communicate the relative performance of the label. Now, so we split the sample in this study into two groups. In one random half of the sample, we investigated the impact of the original carbon label on consumers' choices, and there was an effect on the choices. So in general, members of this group preferred they preferred the low carbon product. We used coffee as the case here. They preferred the low carbon coffee to the high carbon coffee, and the intermediate the coffee with the intermediate carbon footprint also got the intermediate choices here. And like the stretch, as you can see, between these two blue markers here show the actual effect of the original label. When we added the traffic light colors, you could see then like the effect became much wider, much stronger. So people preferred the low carbon label much better, and they disliked the high carbon label much more when they got that relative assessment that was communicated by the traffic lights colors. And that kind of effect of giving relative information has been shown in several other studies as well, like that consumers are much better at processing relative information than absolute. In the food area, actually, it's not so much used to just give people absolute information. So like it's absolute information versus relative. Like the most common way of communicating eco and other sustainability attributes in the food area is actually using what we often call positive labeling. So that is that we use a label to communicate the best in class products, and like that could be an eco label or the Energy Stars, from North America, or an organic label and so on. So the label is put on the good products. It's also quite common to use negative labeling or warning labeling, where like we put warning labels on bad products. These are actually kind of in the food area, the alternatives that you should compare a traffic light labeling to. Like a traffic light labeling would be an example of a graded labeling, like as a label that where you label all products in a specific category, such as like the European energy label, and also some retailers in Europe have introduced an eco score, which is also a gradual label where all products in the category are labeled, and where they use in these cases both letters and colors to communicate the relative performance of the labels. A group of researchers and myself investigated the impact of a graded labeling versus a positive or negative label using the case of mobile phones and microwave ovens, comparing these three approaches to see which one is most effective as guiding consumers. In this study here, we used like a green check mark to signal the positive label, and a red cross to signal the negative for the negative labeling. And then we used this graded label as an eco score label for the graded labeling. So we compared in this study the effectiveness on consumer choices on these three types of systems, like either only labeling the positive, the best in class, or only labeling the worst in class, or labeling all products in the category, but like according to the relative performance. And we did that in a study in 3 different countries in Europe. What we found was that if among consumers that did not see any label on the products, the choices were like you could say, on average, we used a scale from 1 to 5, and the sustainability of the choices was, as one should expect, around 3, which would be like on the middle of the scale. If we added a positive label or a negative label, there was a significantly higher choice of more sustainable products. This result is significant but moderate. If we labeled all products using a graded label, we got a much higher effect on people's choices. So we saw a significantly higher impact on the sustainability of consumers' choices if they got information on all products in the category using a graded labeling system, rather than only labeling the best in class or the worst in class. So in sum, what research shows is that eco-labeling is actually an effective means to increase consumer choices of more eco-friendly products. It helps the eco-concerned consumers to make the choices they want to make. We also find that positive and negative labeling are equally effective at promoting eco-friendly choices, but graded labeling is more effective than both positive and negative labeling. And relative, like traffic light colored labeling, is more effective than absolute scores. So, assessed from an FX perspective, governments should opt for graded labeling, and traffic light colors are useful for the purpose. I have to add, though, that I know from discussions in policy that for graded labeling to work as intended, it needs to be mandatory, and that's a difficult thing to get through. Like a few or many governments are really reluctant to make eco-labeling mandatory, and it's also for sure it mandatory labeling is more costly. So therefore, this kind of labeling could be prohibitive or lead to severe delays. So it could be that in practice, second best solution like positive labeling would be preferable in practice. But if it is at all possible to get through with, we should have mandatory labeling with a graded labeling system. That was the words. Thank you, and I will stop sharing.
Well, thank you so much, John. That was a really interesting presentation. I know I certainly enjoyed it. I see we have a question in the Q&A box. Just a reminder, if you have a question for John, submit it now while it's fresh in your mind, and we'll get to it here at the end of the presentation after David goes. Before we hand things over to David, we do have a question for you, a little bit of a skill testing question, as John may have given away the answer a little bit, but our question for you is, what type of labeling do you think is most effective? Traffic light labeling, voluntary positive labeling, or warning labels, such as the negative ones that John talked about? So we'll give you about a minute to answer that, and then we will move on. Perfect. So yeah, just take those final submissions, and here they come back. So we had 67% of you say traffic light label, 17% of you say voluntary positive labels, and 17% say warning labels. So John, maybe when we come back to you in the Q&A, we can talk a little bit about that. But right now, I'd like you to join me in welcoming David McInnes to discuss the Agri-Food Sustainability Index. So take it away, David.
Well, thanks very much, Sean. And John, I enjoyed hearing your remarks and the outcomes of your research. So thanks for sharing your thoughts. You'll find, folks, that the work that we're doing, which I'm going to get into and explain, doesn't actually nail or hit on the head all about labeling, but it certainly will inform the indirect or the background to that to some degree. So I hope this will be useful for you to fill out the story, if you will. I'm going to share my screen. Sean, I presume that that can be seen. And I had a little bit of disruption in my in hearing some of John's remarks from time to time. So I don't know if that was my end or your end. So Sean, if there is a problem, just go on screen and wave at me. If it
yeah, absolutely. But we can see your slides good.
Okay, I'm going to jump right into this. And essentially what we're trying to zero in on here is one question. How do we know that Canada's agriculture and food sector is sustainable? And frankly, what do we do about this? And how do we leverage this if we are able to answer this? So that's what's seizing the attention of a very broad coalition. And in fact, Sean, you mentioned that there's 80 partners. In fact, there are 123 partners. And as of today, we've just added 124th. And you can see that this coalition is a pre-competitive, is a very broad coalition representing 3 levels of government: federal, provincial, and municipal initiatives, growers, producers, processors, retailers, financial institutions, social, environmental, indigenous organizations, technology and data firms, policy institutes, among many, many others. I think the problem when I start to list that, I know I'm going to be leaving lots of people off. But the point being is that this is a pre-competitive and a highly collaborative and quite an unprecedented coalition that's building momentum here in Canada to help address that answer, or that question rather. So in response to what's going on globally is really should be of no surprise to many of you, but frankly, the world is confronting some fairly serious issues around food sustainability. The global narrative is really that it's not a sustainable food system. And this is having 5 really profound impacts, as you could see there, around the trade environment, around how countries and companies are competing on targets, how everything is being increasingly benchmarked, This is having a rising call for standardization. And I think out of a bracket here, probably a greater interest in labeling and what is in front of the consumer. And also we've seen mandatory ESG, which is the investor capital markets driven environmental, social governance factors. I'm going to touch on a number of these points because this is the essential backdrop, I believe, to our work, and I think to some of the relevant discussion that you might be having today. So around the world, we're seeing countries compete on who is the most trusted or most sustainable. So Canada is not alone in wanting to position its trusted food brand or sustainable and responsible food brand. I'm not going to read all these. You could sort of do a quick scan around the clock here and see how various countries and regions are positioning themselves on this space. This is an important sort of backdrop, which you'll see how this is playing out in the marketplace. Here in Canada, the federal, provincial, territorial ministers of agriculture have come out with a fairly pivotal policy statement back in November of 2021. I'm not going to get into all the details, but the point is that they see Canada as being one of the most recognized producers of sustainable agriculture and food products globally. I don't think too many of us would disagree with that, although John might have a view about the Europeans' food systems. But nevertheless, the point is that I think for any government to declare such an ambition, we believe that the index or benchmarking sustainability is the only way to truly demonstrate that and to build trust. We're also seeing in the marketplace, so if you look at the left side, food companies, large processors here in Europe and around the world, and retailers are making bold targets about the sustainably sourced foods that they provide or sell. But in order for large companies to actually make bold commitments, they have to commit their supply chains. For example, most of the carbon emission footprints of large retailers, up to 90%, are actually embedded in their supply chain. So they have to commit growers and ingredient providers. This is really significant when we talk about change and sustainability. However, it's not just the large companies, producers have to do the same thing. And there's some examples in Canada with the dairy industry and the grain sector, both of whom, by the way, are partners in our work. They're setting net zero targets, but for them to deliver on those, they too have to have a far more systems-wide view of collaboration because they can't do it alone. And I think this is the message, is that target setting is really creating this need for better evidence and data and deeper system-wide collaborations. However, Canada is being benchmarked. We say we're one of the most trusted food systems on the planet, yet when we look at how we are being measured, you could see that our grade, the first two are specific to agriculture, the third on the SDG is a national measure. You could see that as a G7 country, we don't actually rank in the top 10. Now, we did not do a methodological analysis. I think if we were to dive deep in this, you really see some revealing information about how these are measured. Many of them are practice-based, not outcomes-based measures. There's a whole sort of need to understand this. But the point here is that if we don't measure ourselves, we will continue to be measured by others. And I think that is the key message from this. And we can always look at the data specifically, and I think that is important, but that the key message is who is benchmarking, and that is a catalyst for us to sort of figure this out. A major issue is what's going on in the capital markets among security regulators globally. There is a new international organization that's been set up, the International Sustainability Standards Board. It's essentially creating an ESG global standard for publicly listed companies. This is going to be transformative because it's really going to force up disclosures and ESG reporting. The real issue that they're trying to resolve here, and it sort of comes to some of the things that John mentioned, is how can you compare these scores or rankings and the disclosures in the marketplace? Are you measuring apples to apples? There's a risk of greenwashing. And so this is sort of underlying some of the transparency issues and the standardization issues that is unfolding in the marketplace. But significantly, because of these signals coming down, at this global level. This is affecting how individual securities and financial regulators are setting their policies. They are then in turn looking to financial institutions, in this case, Canadian banks, but this is a global development, to review their portfolios, to mark their journey to net zero. And in turn, banks are now starting to increasingly look to their portfolios. Anyone who borrows. Now, this is only at the high corporate level, but frankly, it's moving down into the medium-sized levels because they need to understand how their borrowers are exposed and how they are tracking their journey to net zero. And so this is also having that system-wide impact. So simply because you have a net zero goal, there's really a lot of implications about how to get there, what's in it, and who needs to be engaged in order to follow through on it. So what that all sort of says is that when you boil that quickly down, there's a huge amount of top-down, if you will, pressures from the global marketplace, global dialogues, and the capital markets on improving disclosures and transparency on climate and environmental sustainability. And then from the bottom up, there's a tremendous amount of activity amongst producers. And I would say this across the world, but I'm speaking to Canada specifically, a lot of activity from producers, processors, retailers, provinces and other jurisdictions who are trying to actually respond and declare how they are being more sustainable. And that is exactly the connection point or the midpoint where our initiative to advance a new national index actually comes into play. So I'm going to just delve a little more deeply in that, and then hopefully this will make some sense to you. So we are advancing this coalition I mentioned of 124 private-public partners, the new National Index on Agri-Food Performance. You can see it as 4 big blocks. Usually you think of the 3 Ps, profitability, planet, and people. We've added a whole other block, which is food integrity. This is about food safety. There's animal zoonotic disease and AMR, antimicrobial resistance in there because of animal health is important, and the connection between animal and human health. So we've added that whole new block, but nevertheless, this is what our index is forming up around. It's basically trying to create a consolidated picture of sustainability from production to retail. You'll see an asterisk. I'm going to get into some of what this is not. It's about taking a systems view, particularly emphasizing outcomes-based metrics. Really tough to do. There's data gaps all over the place, or the highest possible metrics, highest quality metrics we can. And it's about showing progress, getting aligned across the sector to step up those disclosures and leverage this. But this is what it's not. And it sort of reflects a bit of John's sort of concluding comments around efficacy of what actions are needed. This is not prescriptive. This is a voluntary effort. It's not comparative, at least now. More data will allow this to be more of a benchmark to be used internally within Canada over time. And we're not measuring consumer diets. This is a huge, I guess, limitation in the one hand. On the other hand, it's sound in terms of how we came across it or decided on this. And that is that consumer diets are really a factor, and healthy diets or sustainable diets are really a factor of social and economic and even education policy and health policy. This index is focused on agriculture and food policy. Now, there's some interaction there and fuzziness, if you will, and that's where the label comes in a little bit. But what we're not doing is producing a consumer-facing label, at least at this point, because we're only into a pilot phase, and there's just a lot more data that we need in order to make this far more meaningful. So that's the overview. But if it's done right, having better data and benchmarking and being transparent and credible is a way to provide value, whether to the marketplace in terms of backing up sustainability claims, which is important for competitiveness in the Canada food brand. If you think of that map I showed earlier, it's also useful in the capital markets to help provide greater context for risk assessments, how this may also be useful to inform policy decisions, innovation and research priorities, and for society by acknowledging and being shortcomings and being transparent. This is a way to mark trust or build greater trust. I'm not going to get into much detail here, but we're in a phase of work, as you could see, leading up to publishing this pilot in the spring, and then leading to how we set up a more permanent center to take this work forward. But we've gone through quite a process, and quite a number of reports are on our website. You'll see the address in the upper corner in terms of how this has been used to build, our process has been used to build momentum and to think this all through. We've also reached out to a whole lot of global organizations. They have formally reviewed our work or have been part of dialogues where we've got some critical thinking or pushed our thinking. And I think they've taken quite an interest as well, I hope, at least, in what we're doing here in Canada. And you can see most recently, or some of the work that we've did actually, a year ago, where these were some extensive formal reviews, including from the University of Calgary. And so we really have taken this external process quite seriously indeed. And right now we're also building this pilot by looking at further global organizations to assess how they're benchmarking or how they are setting standards and how we are aligning or how we're not and what the reasons for those differences are. In other words, how this index remains globally relevant and tuned to developments going on around the world is very important. This is the index itself. This was published back in May. So you can see those 4 blocks of sustainability, many indicators. In fact, there's 20 indicators and over 100 metrics, and those aren't shown. We are now developing the pilot around this. So this map will change. Some of the items here will change, but essentially this is the direction we're going. And I'm just going to give you a glimpse of what's in here, because when you think about how we present data, information, and are transparent and the claims we make, it all comes down to what is being actually measured and how that's put into context. And so under the economic block, I'm not going to delve too deeply here, but this in part is about how the regulatory system is responsive, what sort of innovation system we have to support economic growth. It also links the importance of profitable farms and companies to being environmentally sustainable. And so we bring in that economic perspective. In the societal well-being, we bring in issues about food insecurity and food security, which is a much broader issue. Now, we don't, as I mentioned, measure consumption habits, but we start to bring in other aspects of societal well-being, such as workforce health and well-being and the labor in the marketplace, the labor marketplace as well. In food integrity, this is where we're seeing a lot more interesting data, because this is a highly regulated space, obviously food safety, as it is in many places around the world, and the traceability systems and the labeling requirements to ensure a safe food system and how those are tracked. And so we get into a number of areas of detail here. And then finally, under the environment, clearly, this is one of the larger blocks. This is the larger block. What we don't do, because this is not consumer facing, is we don't get into tracking, for example, consumer food waste, but we're looking at food waste and loss from production to retail, among some other things. So you can see that where our line is around this index and how we're trying to define it. But I wanted to give you just an indication of what was inside it. And so what's up next? Right now, we're completing the development of the index and the metrics and the sourcing of the data. We're also going to be coming out with a series of very short papers to help interpret some selected results to show how it can be leveraged. Concurrently, we're trying to learn how to apply it. Right now, there's some researchers and organizations that are applying this framework to create their own approach and strategies on disclosure reporting. And then, of course, we're leading up to how do we plan for the Center of Agri-Food Benchmarking so that this work can really evolve and step up going forward. So I'll stop there. I know I've thrown a lot at you, but I hope that helps to inform part of this conversation.
Well, thank you so much, David. That was actually fascinating. I am very pleased to see that you folks are kind of undertaking this very large project here in Canada, and it's very encouraging to see that this work is being done. So we have one final poll question that we're going to be popping up for you folks, and then we're going to move into the Q&A section. So after you're done filling out this question, make sure you get your questions in. Our first question for you: which of these prospects of the National Agri-Food Sustainability Index excites you most? Is it an increased competitiveness in the markets? Maybe it's your increase in access to capital, the better policy making that will be made through the implementation of this index, or the improved trust that David talked about in egg products, or you can select all of these. So I'll give you a minute to fill that out. I do see we have some questions coming in as well, and we will have about 12 minutes to do questions after we finish this poll. Perfect. So just get your final answers in, and then we will be sharing the results with you here right away. So 37% of you said competitiveness in markets, 0% of you said access to capital, 11% said better policy making, 26% of you said improved trust in ag products, and 26% of you said all of these. So first I'm going to go to John. John, we'll pose our first question to you. John, why do you think that eco-labeling is only an effective means for people who have already kind of bought into the values of the environment? Do you think that eco-labels are only kind of encouraging to consumers who are already having those environmentally friendly preferences, kind of as you had mentioned?
Well, I thank you for that question. The raison d'etre of eco-labeling, the basic cause of it is, as I said, to assist a person to act on their intentions. So it's for persons who want to buy the eco-friendly products in the stores, but they have no way of knowing what is eco-friendly without the labeling, and then the labeling will help them make these choices. Because eco characteristics are normally what economists call credence characteristics, that is, that they cannot be spotted on the products before you buy, and actually also not when you come home and check. Like take organic, for instance. You cannot, if there's no label, you cannot see if it's organic. But in addition to that effect, it's also, there's also some that says that as like when eco labels are spreading in the store, it raises curiosity among consumers. It also points attention towards the ecological aspects of the food products, and in that way it can also have an educational purpose. So also educating those that may not be that concerned beforehand. So I would say it does have some effect on other people's too, like because people can learn and they can be curious, but the core effect is on those that helping people who are already wanting these products.
Perfect. Thank you, John. David, we've got a really interesting question here in the Q&A box, so I'll pose this one to you. If and how will an unsatisfactory index score point out to policymakers or researchers which component of the supply chain they should be looking into?
Well, thanks for the question. I probably went through my presentation deck pretty quickly, but actually we're not scoring individual farms, producers, companies, the sector, or the country. Because doing so actually would require just a tremendous amount of data and information that we simply don't have. And that's not just to say that this coalition doesn't have access to it. It's not being collected. And it goes to the central challenge of labeling. If you're going to label or score something, you have to have the highest quality, most credible and useful, insightful and timely data to do so. And we just don't have that. Instead, what the coalition was motivated to do was, just given the backdrop of the rising interest and concern around sustainability, was at the very least, we need to step up our disclosure reporting and to get aligned around doing so. There's a tremendous amount of activity taking place in this country and elsewhere, I'm sure, and in Denmark and Europe, around sustainability target setting, disclosures, but getting aligned around what matters actually is a real, I believe it could be a real advantage in the marketplace and help build trust. So that's the first order of business. How do we get aligned on what to measure? And by doing so, we actually started in our process to start to identify where the data gaps are. And this was a first time that not only did we agree on what to measure, we were starting to agree on what the gaps were. And this was a significant sort of change, at least for us, because you can't move on anything else until you know where your data is or what you need to prioritize. So your comment, I really appreciate your question. I think who knows down the road how this may evolve into a much more robust benchmark, because then we'll have time series over time, and as we get more granular data by subsector, so we'll really start to be able to discern impacts and hopefully positive outcomes, or where we have shortcomings over time. So I think it'll become a far more useful benchmark as time permits, or as time unfolds, excuse me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, David. John, our next question's for you, but I would open it up if you want to also just respond to that, because it looked like you kind of were nodding your head along as well. And it looks like you're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So yeah, I can see there's the first one here. I completely agree with the question is that whether isn't it misleading to deem food as good or bad for the environment solely on the carbon emissions. And I think like, of course, I completely agree. Like, and David also illustrated that. The reason why I spoke about carbon labeling is that this is coming up, this is spreading, and also one also has to acknowledge that greenhouse gas emissions is a very significant pollution from food, but in addition to that, David showed in his slides that you're also measuring biodiversity, water, soil. Like there's a number of other environmental issues that are important. I have done some research with a grad student that's published on can we do a meta labeling, so where we label all the issues at the same time. It's actually not very easy, but in order to avoid what we call a waterbed effect, so that you solve one problem like the carbon problem and then create another problem that you didn't focus on. And I think that's what is in this question here. But so that's also one reason why in Europe the European Union speak about a product environmental footprint, not product carbon footprint. So they actually suggest that we should label the whole environmental impact, not only the carbon impact. But be careful, like even though this is true, still, of course, greenhouse gas emissions is a big issue when it comes to agricultural production.
Perfect. Thank you, John. This next question, I'm going to kind of change a little bit so I can post to both of you. So we have a question here around how you handle food products from other countries that may not have an interest in either labeling or developing a sustainable index. So maybe to you first, David, how is kind of Canada going to manage those kind of international obligations and interactions we have and kind of developing our sustainable index?
Well, thanks for that. In fact, I want to play back the phrase that John used about the waterbed effect. I really like that, because it actually, we had some very deep conversations around, and maybe I'm not interpreting this the right way, John, but around the trade-offs, because you can measure one thing. So for example, you want to reduce plastic waste. Well, you may actually create a food safety question because of the impact. And so the trade-offs between these indicators and measures, not just in ours, but anywhere, they're really important. And I thought waterbed metaphor, I think, really worked for me. In terms of the question, this is not specific to
David, I think we lost your audio. David, can you hear me?
Of being in a creating world. So I'm sorry, can you hear me?
So you just cut out there at the end.
Okay.
So maybe if you just kind of want to go from kind of the midpoint of your points,
Okay.
and then we'll continue. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Just wave so I can see you, then I'll stop. Yeah, so the issue that I was trying to identify is that the question is specific to sustainability, but in fact, in no way is it only about sustainability. This applies to food safety, animal care, labor standards, where you have different countries around the world that may subscribe or not to the global standard. But it also applies to sustainability. So we can't measure in one food system all of these factors, what's going on abroad. And that's where the importance of the global goals come in, and this march or race to net zero, because it's trying to equalize the global trade environment and the priorities to be more sustainable. So I really acknowledge the question, but it's inevitable. You cannot equate this all the time because there's just too many factors at play. But maybe I'll build off John's response too.
Thank you. Yeah, if I take over about this question, I see like whether what do we do in a globalized world? I actually think that labeling has part of the solution for this. Like in the European Union, and I think it's the same in Canada, it is possible to sell imported organic products, for instance, so that you can sell organic products like from China in Europe or from Canada in Europe, if it's labeled with the European label. So it means that it has to go through the controls and the same criteria as in Europe. I know it's the same in Canada because Denmark actually export organic food products to Canada and also has to comply with Canadian regulation there in order to get the Canadian organic label on it. And of course, that can be extended also to other products. So but of course, it demands then that if imported products want to claim a certain sustainability quality, like a low carbon footprint or organic or whatnot, they have to comply with the regulations of the importing country, and there has to be a control system in place, and that kind of control systems are in place for some products, but not for all. So, yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you, John, and thank you, David. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we did get through all the questions. But I want to thank you both for taking time to present to us today. I think the work that both of you are doing is really fascinating and is really going to be important as we kind of move forward over the next decade and move towards 2030. So thank you, everyone in the audience, for attending today's webinar. We really hope you enjoyed it. And if you could, please let us know your feedback by filling out the questionnaire that's going to be emailed to you later this week. But thank you all for joining us. Staying warm out there. It's a little cold here in Alberta, and hopefully not too cold where you are, but have a good day and enjoy.